Hello there, you're welcome to China Now, the show that keeps you in the loop with the latest from China. My name is Makiza Latifa and I'm elated to be here as always. Let's begin with China Currents, where we bring you a weekly update on the most trending stories from across the country, offering insights into everything from breaking news to cultural shift. This week, your host Chris is here to guide you through the headlines, bringing expert commentary and analysis. Let's get started with the stories that matter and what's shaping China today. One of the major highlights of today's stories is China becoming the second largest medical innovation center in the world. Very interesting, right? I bet you can't wait for the details, so let's get started.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on the latest developments in China. I'm Chris, and in this episode, Australia lost its balls to Chinese Navy, and Trump lost his mind to Chinese investments, and China has become the second largest medical innovation center in the world. First, let's dive into the warm South Pacific. On February 21st and 22nd, the Chinese Navy conducted two live-fire exercises in the international waters between Australia and New Zealand. By Western standards, military drills in international waters with prior notices are not just normal, but essential for safeguarding freedom of navigation. But they seem to have a problem when it was China who tries to have a shot at a noble task. For instance, US news agency Associated Press News falsely claimed that the airliners were warned of flying over a secret live-fire exercise. In contrast, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that the Australian military detected the ships a week before the exercise, and that China had issued safety warnings in advance to airlines including Qantas, Jetstar, Virgin, and Emirates. These details are available to the public and not hidden behind any paywall. The Chinese Navy's planned exercise was communicated through radio broadcasts, meaning anyone with access to radio, whether fishermen, pilots, or divers, could receive the notice. It's baffling how AP News can call it a secret. What's even more perplexing is the reaction from certain Australian politicians. Shadow Minister for Defence Andrew Hastie labelled the Chinese military exercise as a provocation. Meanwhile, Andrew Wallace, the Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, pointed out the hypocrisy of Australia criticizing China's actions while conducting some military operations far from its shores. For those at the AP News who may have missed the secret, on February 7th, warships from the US, the Philippines, Japan, and Australia participated in a joint maritime exercise in the South China Sea. On February 11th, an Australian military aircraft entered Chinese airspace over the Shisha Islands without permission. As Wallace put it, "We can't talk about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and then criticize China over an exercise like this." They haven't done anything wrong. And interestingly, Hastie also accused Beijing of using gunboat diplomacy to test US allies such as Australia. It's a curious statement though, considering that while Australia has tried hard to prove its loyalty to the United States, the US has never truly regarded Australia as an equal ally. Australia, a member of AUKUS, an alliance built on contract of dealing second-hand nuclear submarines. To obtain 3 US Virginia-class submarines, Australia will spend a staggering $368 billion. But despite Australia's lofty expectations, a report published by the US Congressional Budget Office in January, titled An Analysis of the Navy's 2025 Shipbuilding Plan, states that the larger Columbia-class SSBNs are US Navy's highest acquisition priority. And a sale of SSNs to Australia could reduce the number of attack submarines available to the Navy, which translates as, "We're busy, don't come bother us, just wait." Australian Greens Senator David Shoebridge called the report damning, arguing it further demonstrates that Australia's nuclear submarine plans are unraveling. Even though Australia has already invested about $3 billion in the first 4 years, the US shipbuilding industry is nowhere near producing enough nuclear submarines to meet the demand, with no clear solution in sight. And buying submarines is not ordering Panda Express. And it's hard to find an alternative supplier, especially after they tore up the contract with France in 2021. On February 22nd, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese reiterated that China had adhered to the international law, emphasizing that no Australian assets were in danger. Defense Minister Richard Marles also clarified that Chinese ships did not enter Australia's territorial waters. New Zealand PM Christopher Luxon also said on February 24th that there is nothing illegal here in terms of they are compliant with international law. However, he added, we'd appreciate a little bit more advance notice. Sure thing, mate, but what matters the most here is getting used to it. As the PLA Navy continues to make strides in the deep blue, drills in the high seas will become more frequent. So don't be surprised. Next up, a not surprised move from Mr. Trump. On February 21st, Donald Trump signed an order directing the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to restrict Chinese investments. Reuters reports this aim to safeguard U.S. national interest. Yet, some argue it could lead to significant losses for American companies and citizens. Forbes suggests that as of 2023, Chinese companies had poured roughly $53 billion into U.S. facilities. The U.S.-China Business Council estimates these investments supported 229,000 American jobs, though that figure reflects earlier highs. The Rhodium Group notes that during Trump's first term, his trade war slashed Chinese investment from $46 billion in 2016 to under $5 billion by 2022. Job numbers tied to these investments fell to around 197,000 by 2018. Critics argue American citizens will shoulder the cost of Trump's protectionist stance, and his second-term trade war too will worsen the trend. Trump's policies could also deal a blow to Wall Street. Reuters reports he's eyeing tighter restrictions on U.S. investments in China's tech sector. Yet, the American Chamber of Commerce in China's latest survey shows nearly half of U.S. companies still rank China among their top 3 global investment destinations. The rise of DeepSeek has sparked growing global investor interest in China, with Chinese tech stocks climbing since early 2025. Jeff Vinegar, an equity strategist at Wisdom Tree, claims the top 10 Chinese high-tech firms have outpaced U.S. giants like Apple, Nvidia, and Tesla. A February 5th Deutsche Bank report highlights Chinese companies' leadership across industries, touting their superior investment value. If Trump keeps tightening investment restrictions on China, U.S. firms could lose ground to competitors from the global south. Still, while some American investors struggle to profit in China, Elon Musk's Tesla continues to thrive there. Proof the rules don't bind everyone. Okay, moving on February 21st, the Global Times reported that China has emerged as the world's second-largest hub for medical innovation. According to a report from China's National Medical Products Administration, the country has greenlit 48 innovative drugs for market entry, targeting critical illnesses like ovarian cancer, diabetes, stroke, and other chronic conditions. This progress promises improved health outcomes and economic benefits, not just for China, but for the world. This shift enables China's healthcare system to lean on domestic products over pricey imports, saving money for its people. Take atopic dermatitis treatment. US and EU drugs have long ruled, with a single dose averaging around $2,200. And enter Keymed Biosciences, a Chinese firm, with its innovative drug Stepokibart, priced below $180 per dose. This steep cost drop eases patients' financial strain and vastly improves access to effective care. This doesn't spell doom for Western researchers' jobs. Quite the opposite. China's ascent is sparking global opportunities. Take Hengrui Medicine. Since 2011, it's won approval for 22 new drugs in China and is charging onto the world stage. With over 90 innovative products in development and nearly 400 clinical trials worldwide, Hengrui's R&D hubs span China, the US, Switzerland, and beyond. Its global R&D team now tops 5,500, over a quarter of its workforce, fueling both Chinese farmers' edge and a broader industry's growth. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments, please reach us at the email address below. And see you next time.
And next up, we have the Thinkers Forum, a segment where brilliant minds and scholars come together to share their insights on the most pressing global issues. From politics and economics to culture and society, we bring you thought-provoking conversations that challenge the way we see the world. Stay tuned for a deep dive into the ideas shaping our future. Our guest for today is Shaun Rein, the founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group. And he will be speaking in relation to the Chinese economy and President Xi Jinping's significant symposium with China's leading entrepreneurs earlier this week.
My name is Shaun Rein. I'm the founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group, which I founded in 2005 in Shanghai, China. I think when you look at it, earlier this week, Xi Jinping, for the first time since 2018, met with many of China's leading entrepreneurs in a public symposium. He met with people like the founder of DeepSeek, Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, as well as the founder of NEV Miracle BYD. Now, it's very important that Xi Jinping made a show to meet China's leading entrepreneurs, because one of the problems that's been happening in China in the last 4 years is a loss of animal spirits. There's been a loss amongst the wealthy 10% of China and their lack of optimism. There's been a real pessimism that's been flowing throughout the business community. Now, I've been in China for almost 30 years. I love China. It's been an economic miracle, but we have to be honest. The last 4 years have been a real rough time for China economically. Now, in my 30 years here, there have only been 2 times that I've been worried about China from a systemic financial threat. The first was in October of 2022. At the time, Chinese consumers weren't willing to go to a restaurant or go to a store because they were worried that they or their kids would be called a close contact of a close contact and be sent away to a Fangcang hospital for quarantine for 10 days. So at that period, the entire economy was locked down. No business was being done. Nobody was spending money. The second time that I was very worried about China's economy was in August of 2024. You saw that youth unemployment hit 18.8%, housing prices dropped about 30%, and there was a fear amongst Chinese consumers and Chinese businessmen about the geopolitics overhang between US and China. People were scared that Trump would win. People were scared that Biden or later Harris would win the presidency. So the entire economy in China crawled to a stop. And that's one of the reasons why I think you've seen such slow economic growth over the last 4 years. So it's very important for Xi Jinping, Li Qiang, Wang Huning, and the CPC's leadership to meet with China's great entrepreneurs earlier this week to show that China is supporting the private sector, that China supporting innovation and technology, and to put on a show that, you know what, China can beat crippling sanctions from the United States and still thrive economically. As we all saw with DeepSeek a couple weeks ago, that DeepSeek and Chinese companies are able to create AI that's as good, if not better, than what you have in the United States. And so having this meeting was a real show to say the government is supporting the private sector to overcome crippling American sanctions, which I consider to be immoral. I first came to China to study at Nankai University in Tianjin, China in 1997. And what I found on the ground, the reality, was completely different from what I read in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And over the last 30 years, I found that a lot of US media outlets just aren't objective, just aren't nuanced when it comes to coverage with China. Now, part of that is because a lot of their journalists who cover China for a living don't speak Chinese. You have people like Gady Epstein, who was the China bureau chief for The Economist. He actually lived in China for 10 years. He doesn't speak the language. So you have people who I think are presenting a biased, misinformed narrative of China's rise. So it's very rare that I read Western journals. I like to say that you'll get dumber and learn less about China if you read The Economist or the New York Times. Now, there are some good Western publications that are pretty good. The Financial Times, I have a lot of respect for. I know most of their journalists over the last 20 years, and I find them to truly be wanting to understand China. South China Morning Post from Hong Kong has some decent journalists as well. They're not quite as in-depth or quite as good journalists, like in terms of storytelling, as the guys at the FT. And I think Caixin Media is very good. But I really don't read much of Western press to learn about China. I read the Western press to see what the Americans and the Europeans are thinking about China. If you really want to understand what's happening on the ground in China, obviously the best way is to travel throughout the country. You know, during COVID, I went to almost half of China's provinces. I went to Tibet twice. I went to Xinjiang twice, and I run a research firm. Now, obviously, not everybody can do that. So how should you get information about China? First, go on to Xiaohongshu or Red Note or Red. This is one of the amazing new apps that has opened up in the last couple weeks in China, where now you have Americans and Chinese are able to communicate. And I think one of the things that Chinese are finding is America's not as good as they originally thought it was. But a lot of Americans are finding out China's not as bad as they thought it was. So there's a lot of information flow. I also like looking at apps like Douyin or TikTok, and you can see how everyday people live and how everyday people feel. But in terms of Chinese media, I actually look at Xinhua and People's Daily to sort of read between the lines. So for instance, if they say that Chinese youth employment has improved by 2% over the last month, you probably know that youth employment numbers are very high. So you sort of want to read the opposite of what they're saying and read between the lines. But the best way is to try to come here, visit China, see with your own eyes what's really happening on the ground. You might be surprised about how China is. I know I was when I came in 1997. I found in the Western press, they kept talking about how the Chinese people were oppressed by the Chinese government. I found that there was an electric optimism in the country. I found that people supported then Prime Minister Zhu Rongji's economic reforms, and they felt that the lives of their children would be better than the lives of their own. And that's what I saw on the ground in 1997. And truthfully, until 2017, 2018, China was the most optimistic country in the world. It was really exciting to see. Now that optimism, frankly, has dropped in the last couple of years because of some of the COVID policies that hampered business and also the US-China overhang. So I just recently released a book called The Split, Finding the Opportunities in China's Economy and the New World Order. And I divide China's population into two groups. The first is the 90%. This is the majority of Chinese. These are low-income, middle-class Chinese. The second group are the 10%. These are wealthy Chinese throughout the entire country. These are people living in tier 1 cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. These are the real movers and shakers of the country. Now, frankly, the 10% they've had their optimism really diminished over the last 4 or 5 years. They've also had their animal spirits dissipate. And this is a problem for China's economy because the 10% are the movers and shakers. And unfortunately, they haven't been moving and shaking in the last 4 or 5 years. They've stopped investing, they've stopped buying, they've put a lot of their money to capital outflows, which is why you've seen so much pressure on capital outflows to Singapore, why a lot of people were doing illegal things like buying Bitcoin, and why a lot of the wealthy 10% were immigrating and moving to countries like Singapore, Australia, Canada, and even the United States. The 10% were worried over the last 4 or 5 years for a couple of reasons. The first comes to geopolitics. The United States under Trump, but really especially under Biden, who doubled down on Trump's tariffs, was seen as trying to contain China's economic and political growth. There was a feeling that Biden was trying to destabilize China and try to potentially push for regime change and overthrow the CPC. When the Chinese got good at telecom, like Huawei, the Americans said that Huawei was a national security threat and slapped sanctions on them. When China got good at apps like Temu and Shine, the United States said forced labor, or they're breaking laws by selling things too cheap, so we have to get rid of the de minimis $800 law that allowed Chinese apps from selling into the United States tariff-free. When Chinese companies like TikTok started to take over social media. The Americans said this is a national security threat because TikTok is going to spy on your children. When the Chinese got good at cotton, you got to remember 20% of the world's cotton, arguably the best in the world, comes from Xinjiang province. The Americans said that there's genocide or forced labor taking place in Xinjiang. So there was a feeling amongst the 10% over the last 4 or 5 years that the United States would try to impoverish China, the way that the United States has impoverished North Korea, the way that the United States has impoverished Iran, the way that the United States has impoverished Cuba for generations. And there's a fear amongst the 10% wealthy in China that we're entering a 10, 20-year minimum Cold War where the United States would do whatever it can to oppress China. Now, I'm an American. I love the United States. I would love for Trump to fire Marco Rubio and name me next Secretary of State. I've long thought about moving back to the U.S. and running for Senate. I'm a red-blooded American. I love the United States. But I think, frankly, what the United States has done to China under the Biden regime was wrong. It's morally wrong trying to impoverish 1.4 billion Chinese simply because China exists and is becoming a powerful country. In many ways, China's system over the last 40 years has helped the low and middle income Chinese better than the American system, where the Gini coefficient is getting wider and bigger and bigger. So I think there was a fear amongst the 10% that if they invested in a new company, they would get hit by sanctions. They would get hit by tariffs, and they wouldn't be able to grow. I'll give an example. In my book, The Split, I have a chapter on artificial intelligence. And I argue that China's AI is going to be as good or even surpass that of the United States. Now, this is very different from Eric Schmidt, who's the former CEO of Google. A couple years ago, he said that China was 10 years behind America on AI. Last year, he said China was 2 or 3 years behind. But as you've seen with DeepSeek, China is as good, if not better, than American AI, and they're able to do it at a fraction of the price. But until DeepSeek arrived, there was a fear amongst the 10% that Chinese companies couldn't rise because America would try to hurt China no matter what. And that's what stopped a lot of Chinese from starting companies or investing in companies because they said there's no hope. They just want to see what the geopolitical winds would say. That's one part of it. The second part, frankly, and it's a little bit more sensitive, is that there was a fear in China that Xi Jinping and the CPC was anti-business or anti-wealthy people. And so a lot of Chinese and especially international investors were worried that China was becoming anti-business, especially with the Common Prosperity Drive. Now, my own view is different. I actually think the Common Prosperity Drive is good. How can Xi Jinping and the CPC say that they represent the people if they're not trying to get access to health care towards low-income and middle-income Chinese? So that's good. The crackdown was also good on Jack Ma and Alibaba and the whole tech sector because Tencent and Alibaba were basically becoming a duopoly. They were strangling and stifling innovation, fair competition, in China. Basically, if you were a startup, if you were an entrepreneur, you had to get money from Tencent or Alibaba. If you didn't, you would have been squashed by those two. So I actually think the government was right to crack down on them. And without that crackdown, you wouldn't have seen the rise of what I call little dragons. Companies like Pinduoduo, companies like ByteDance, the owner of Douyin and TikTok, or companies like Xiaomi, companies like DeepSeek. So the crackdown was good. But here's my one issue. I think the government didn't do a good enough job at communicating both within China, but especially internationally, the reason for the crackdown. It also cut too far to the bone. I think a lot of people thought that the crackdown was due to the party and Xi Jinping himself not liking Jack Ma and thinking that Jack Ma was a rival to the power of the CPC. Again, I don't think that was the reason for the crackdown. I think it was more about creating fair competition. But when you don't announce something, that's when rumors get spread everywhere. And so there was a lot of rumors that this was a political infight rather than something good for the Chinese population, which is why I think it was great that Xi Jinping himself met with Jack Ma earlier this week at the public symposium, because this was a signal. In many ways, this was kind of reminiscent of Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour when he said, we need to have the economy and private enterprise flow. So this meeting was critical to show the 10% in China that the government is supportive of private industry, and I hope that they'll make it clear that it's okay to try to be rich again, that while you want to protect the 90%, while you want common prosperity, at the same time you have to make sure that you don't destroy the animal spirits and you don't destroy the confidence and the optimism of the 10%, because you can't achieve an end of poverty, you can't achieve a better quality of life for the 90% if the 10% aren't doing business, if the 10% are sending their money to Singapore, or if the 10% are holding all their capital into banks and saving their pennies. So this was incredibly important for the government to show the private sector and show international investors that China is open for business again.
Let's now turn to Overlap, featuring a discussion between Professor Shen Yi, a distinguished scholar of international politics at Fudan University, and Mr. Bernardo Mendia, Secretary General of the Portugal-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Stay with us for more details.
First of all, I have no insights as to if they're going to issue more sanctions. Secondly, the reasons are related to what we've just discussed. It's to follow the advice of the strategic allies that Europe believes at this moment. Not Europe, but some people in Europe believe at this moment it is in the best interest of Europe. In my opinion, which is just my opinion, this is a misrepresentation of our interest, of course. And it's what we have been saying. I mean, if you put the interest of the people first, there's no way you're going to sanction companies. It's not working. We know the sanctions are not working, are not useful. We need to put the dialogue always first. We need to put the diplomacy, and we have opportunities when we have new leaders, and so I think now is an opportunity to recalibrate all of this international mess that we're living currently. And I'm also crossing my fingers for that.
Yeah, it's also a big concern or sometimes confused or even more angers from China's side. I think that you must read the deputy of China in the United Nations, Mr. Geng Shuang. He made his speech when he faced those stupid misinformation raised by the US deputy representatives in the European Union Security Council's dialogue on these Ukraine issues. And Geng Shuang sending a very clear signal. He said that if China really did something, which means providing the aid to Russian side on this conflict, that is front line of the conflict will be not today's situation. From China's side, his speech made a great shock because it's the very first time for China's official representatives to make this quite clear. I think that for Chinese peoples, which has a better understanding of China's capacities of productions, finding that Geng Shuang make these things very clear. Its implication is quite simple. If China did aid Russia on this military elements, technologies, or capacities, or productions, as European Unions or United States believe China did it, we can change these things. Maybe all the issues already been over because China has huge capacities, but China don't. We don't provide these things. But from China's side is such kind of sections. I mean that European Unions is the first time add China's entity in those lists. It will trigger a very negative feedback from China's side. The first, it providing China one more evidence that European Union, especially those politicians in Brussels, they cannot be trusted. they don't have enough capacities to finding out what the real world is, what China did or China did not. They just live in the world mainly based on their imaginations. Because sometimes I think that I can say personally, I believe such kind of accusation of China's companies or China's aid to so-called Russia is nothing more than an excuse or to finding out a so-called reasonable reasons for their failure policy and strategies in these Russia and Ukraine issues. The first. And the second, we have to understand nowadays, even inside of Chinese peoples, we have a full access of all those new media's platforms, new media's tools based on this ICT. We have these social medias and this fragment of this information that European unions add China's entity to those lists and launch sanction to these Chinese entities for something they didn't do it. It's providing a very negative influential for those normal netizens inside China. These peoples are very, very active on these things, and their attitude will create a kind of atmosphere which is negative for our future development between to our side, because the government not easy for Chinese government to persuade its peoples. We still need to development of our relationship toward the European Union, toward EU countries, even though they did this such kind of stupid things to do damage to our national interest. I hope that, Brad, do you think it's possible for European politicians to change their policy or attitude on these things, especially if we consider such kind of scenarios? What will happen if Trump really makes some change of United States policy toward this Ukraine and the Russia conflict when he really entered the White House? If he lower it down or make some limitations, restrictions for providing aid to Ukraine, not terminate it, but just level it down dramatically. Is it possible for European unions to change its policies, or especially is it possible or to how to make it possible for European unions to remove those China's entities from that list? Is it possible, or if possible, how to do it?
Yeah, it is possible, but it is through the democratic process. What I mean is, it's not possible with the people that are there now, because they would lose a lot of face. But this happens naturally in Europe, because we keep having elections, people keep changing. We know we have voices saying with different opinions. So as to the people that are now, the leaders that are now, it is possible to improve a little bit, but it is not possible to reverse it totally. That is not possible with these people. But to improve, yes. And to improve, we go back to what we discussed a while ago. It is a lot about communication, about talking, about showing evidence. And this is why it's so important to keep all these diplomatic channels open, to keep the social media also with smart people talking, which fortunately we have a lot. And a lot of people, you see a lot of people smarting up and seeing what's really going on, but still minority in what concerns the relationship with China, because most people, and I would say maybe 90% of the politicians here in Brussels, maybe they never went to China, or if they did, they went for a trip, they don't know. So they just they follow whatever the party they belong to is deciding that is the best for the party. Of course, there is hope. I think yes, I know I'm maybe over optimistic, but of course I'm hopeful. Also, I think there is a way which is to improve the current feeling of the people, which is negative towards China, we have to say. Not only these politicians, but also the image they pass down, of course. We have to keep opening more channels and providing evidence, discussing, inviting, try to persuade also to go to do these high-level meetings with the Chinese government. This year is the 50th anniversary of the European Union and China diplomatic relationship. This is also a great opportunity to showcase the benefits of a win-win relationship between the two blocs. So we need to use every opportunity to do what we believe it is right by showing evidence, by discussing. Because if we discuss with ideas, we will demonstrate what's right. We might not reach out to everyone because some people have this deep-seated emotions and ideology that is difficult to persuade them otherwise. But that's okay. I mean, we cannot persuade everyone. They're free to have their own opinion, no matter how stupid we might believe it is. They might think the same about what we think. So it's okay. As long as we can keep discussing and persuade some, I think that's good enough.
Yes, thank you. I think, Bernardo, you're providing us lots of optimistic driving force and make me believe that if there will be more people like you inside Brazil and the European countries, we definitely have more enough reasons to keep optimistic attitude to our future relationships. Just you mentioned, this year is the anniversaries that our two sides build our relationships. It's very important for us. I think comparing to United States, China and the European Unions, maybe at least we should, according to my personal ideas, have far more better and common understandings on how to ensure the sustainable development of our own countries in more general ways. And also, I think during our relationship development in the past several decades, we already has enough experience how to ensure or to guard these so-called win-win strategic scenarios. And if we can exchange more effectively those truth informations, we can keep our communications to take a more practical attitude to deal with all these disputes and try our best to enhance the development of our joint ventures in all possible fields, which make us got benefits, not only to level up our living standard, to improve our economies, but to make our normal peoples to have the opportunities, have better understanding, have this face-to-face communication and exchange to control or to degrade those misinformation or disinformations, which providing us negative or inaccurate understanding toward each other's. It will highly possible for us, and it's very necessary for us to ensure our future development of our bilateral relationships in a general ways. I wish that your ideas will come true in this year, and wish to have more better and constructive signals from both sides.
Yes, I hope so. I agree with you. Thank you. In a way, that already happens at the European Commission level. There is the general push is for more power to the European Union. Right now, there is a huge push for that. But and this is at a political, at a leadership level. This is what they're pushing for. But at the people, I do not feel this is accompanied by the people. And I can tell you from my personal point of view that the interest of my country is different many times from the interest of the European Union or the European Commission, better said. So this will be this for sure that the European Commission will push for that. We see some national parties in each country of the European Union also pushing for this agenda. Personally, I'm totally against that. I think we should keep our autonomy and our decision-making process more inside borders, and the leaders should be closer to the people, not so far away. But but we will see. I cannot divisions. Yeah, there will be divisions in what regards this tendency. If it is going to go one way or the other way, I am totally in favor of the European Union. I think it brings a lot of power and to defend our interests, the interest of the Portuguese people, to be part of the European Union. And but my main focus is, of course, the interest of the Portuguese people, and the interest of the European people is my second interest, if you want to put it in a hierarchy.
I think that Bernardo, you're providing us a very important and helpful insight from your side to have better understanding of the development of these European unions and our relationships with EU. And my point, I want to add one last point to your point of views. I think maybe it's really appropriate time for rational peoples, either businessmen or politicians, those rational peoples are rational as yours, maybe you need to input more energies and efforts to improve our bilateral relationships. It's a proper time to rethink that. Just you mentioned, maybe it's a time to think whether it's properly to just let those peoples inside the European EU commissions to make total decisions, especially if these guys make wrong decisions, their interest not fit for either the single member state of European unions or the interest of European unions in the more general ways, how to stop it, how to make some leverages to make a proper balancing of this process. Maybe that could be one kind of very important future development of EU or to building the structures and the decision-making process more properly in the future times. And also, I wish that in futures we are not seeing only those single companies, single member state, or single politicians to voice out the truth that European unions and European commissions should represent the real interest of European peoples and European countries, should not only working for those members, their personal ideas or personal understandings of European interest in the wrong ways. That will be a very tough challenges, but I sincerely wish that in futures you guys can finding proper solutions. And I think it will be very important for both of us, not only both of us, important for China, important for European unions, but also very important for the world, because you guys are really a cluster of developed countries which take a very special positions in today's world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
And all too soon, we have come to the end of the show. Thank you for joining us on today's edition of China Now. We hope you found our discussions insightful and engaging. My name is Makiza Latifa, and we appreciate your time and interest. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll continue to bring you the latest insights and discussions on China's role in the global landscape. See you next week.